The cost of context switching fatigue. You're at your desk. You have exactly what you need in front of you. And somehow, nothing gets done. You write half a sentence. A message comes in. You go back to the document, stare at the screen, write another half a sentence. By late afternoon, the list looks almost identical to how it looked at 9 in the morning. Most people assume that's a motivation problem, that they just need to push harder, focus more, care more. It isn't motivation. Researchers have spent years studying what actually happens inside the brain during a fragmented workday. And what they found is that the exhaustion you've been carrying around, that strange heaviness that has nothing to do with how much you slept, isn't a mystery. It has a precise mechanism. And once you understand that mechanism, the way you experience your working day starts to make a very different kind of sense. In this episode, you're going to understand exactly why your brain struggles to produce anything meaningful on a day full of switching, and what you can actually do about it, starting tomorrow. You're listening to Your Space Today, the podcast where we decode fatigue, stress, and burnout so you can rise again. Every Tuesday, we explore the hidden connections between your habits, your health, and your happiness, giving you the tools to take back your energy and your life. Daniel is a 44-year-old senior financial analyst at an asset management firm. He's the kind of person colleagues describe as methodical, someone who reads everything before he responds, who keeps his models clean, who rarely makes the kind of error that matters. He's been good at this for 20 years. The precision is almost muscle memory by now. But lately, something has been bothering him. He'll sit down to write an investment commentary. He's done it hundreds of times, and 20 minutes will pass with almost nothing to show for it. He knows the material. He could explain any part of it in conversation without hesitation. But when he opens the document, something isn't available. His mind feels occupied, not distracted by anything specific, just taken up, like a room where all the chairs are already filled. He assumes it's age, or stress, that it'll clear after a decent weekend. It doesn't clear. What Daniel doesn't yet understand is that his brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It's just doing it in an environment that makes the cost enormous. Because every time he switches tasks, every time he closes the model and answers a message, joins a call and then returns to the commentary, pivots between a client request and a quarterly report, what the research suggests he's leaving behind is a trace, a thread. And by the time he sits down to the work that actually requires something of him, those traces have accumulated into something heavy enough to feel like a wall. This isn't a failure of discipline, and it isn't a sign that the work has become too much for him. It's the predictable result of a biological process that almost no one in the modern workplace is ever taught about. The standard assumption is that focus is something you summon through willpower, that if you want it enough, you'll find it. But willpower operates on a system, and if that system is already partially committed to 3 other things you haven't finished, no amount of wanting changes how much of it is actually available for what's in front of you. In a few minutes, we'll look at what you can do to genuinely recover that capacity, not through more discipline, but through a small change in how you handle transitions. But first, let's understand what's actually happening in the brain, because here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where most productivity advice goes completely wrong. There's a researcher at the University of Washington named Sophie Leroy, who has spent over 20 years studying something that almost everyone experiences and almost no one names. She calls it attention residue. The finding, broadly stated, is this: when you switch from one task to another, especially when the first task is unfinished or when you're working under time pressure, your attention doesn't fully make the journey with you. Part of it stays behind, still processing the thing you just left, still running in the background, like an application you've minimized but haven't actually closed. And that residue takes up space. Specifically, it occupies working memory, the cognitive resource your brain uses to hold and manipulate information in the moment. Working memory isn't unlimited. What's consumed by residue from one task isn't available for the next. So you arrive at the new task already operating at a reduced capacity, even if nothing about the task itself has changed. Leroy's research showed this in measurable terms. People who carry attention residue into a new task produce lower quality work, not because they lack the capability, but because their available attention is divided. The capability is there. The accessible portion of it isn't. The brain's tendency to hold on to unfinished things is a feature, not a bug. There's a well-established principle in psychology, sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect, that the mind instinctively keeps track of incomplete tasks, returning to them, maintaining them as active concerns. It's a system designed to make sure you don't forget things that matter. But in a modern work environment, where you might make a dozen task switches before lunch, that same system is continuously running background processes on everything you haven't finished yet. By mid-morning, the cognitive overhead of all those open loops is substantial. Leroy's work on attention residue and separate research into task switching costs each point to the same outcome through slightly different routes. Researchers studying the behavioral costs of task transitions found that every switch from one kind of work to another requires a genuine reconfiguration process. The brain has to disengage from the rules and goals of what it was just doing and re-engage with the rules and goals of what it's doing next. This isn't instantaneous. It takes effort. And it becomes increasingly costly as the tasks are more complex or more different from each other. Each switch carries a cost. Enough switches across a day, and the accumulated cost becomes the exhaustion you feel by early afternoon, a heaviness that has nothing to do with how hard the individual tasks were. One analogy that captures this well: think of the brain like a computer running too many applications at once. The programs aren't all visible on screen, but they're all still drawing from the same pool of processing power. Start demanding work from a machine running that many background processes, and it slows. It struggles. Not because the program you're trying to run is too demanding, but because the machine running it is already burdened. This is why just focus is the least useful advice anyone can give in this situation. You can't focus your way out of a working memory that's already partially occupied. The constraint isn't motivation, it's architecture. And if this is true, which the research fairly consistently suggests it is, then most of what we reach for to fix it is aimed at exactly the wrong thing. The standard response to a fragmented, unproductive day is to add more structure to it. Block your calendar. Set firmer boundaries around email. Be more intentional. Start earlier. Stay later. Get a better system. And none of it really works. Not in any lasting way. Because all of those solutions treat this as an organization problem or a motivation problem. What it is, at its root, is a cognitive and physiological one. If the obstacle is that your brain's working memory is already partly committed to the residue of tasks you haven't properly closed, no amount of calendar restructuring addresses that, unless the restructuring includes something that actually clears the residue. This is where the conversation usually stops short, and it's also where the wider picture becomes important. Because attention residue doesn't operate in isolation. When you look at a chronically fragmented, cognitively depleted day and trace back all the things contributing to it, they tend to cluster around a set of connected areas that interact with each other in ways most productivity advice never touches. What you eat through the day matters more than most people realize. The brain depends on a stable energy supply and blood sugar that swings sharply because of skipped meals or lunches built around processed food directly reduces the cognitive buffer available for demanding tasks. Research has shown that significant glucose fluctuations are associated with reduced cognitive performance and slower thinking, which means the margin you have for absorbing the mental tax of task switching narrows at exactly the times when you need it most. Movement matters in a parallel but different way. Research has found that even brief physical activity, a genuine few minutes away from the desk, a short walk to somewhere else, increases blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain most responsible for focus and the management of competing demands. In the context of task switching, these aren't just general break benefits. They serve as a reset between transitions, temporarily restoring the capacity that switching costs erode. A day without them is a day where the system stays burdened without relief. Then there's the emotional layer that almost always goes unmentioned. Rumination, replaying difficult interactions, quietly rehearsing problems that haven't happened yet, carrying a background hum of self-criticism, creates its own kind of residue. The same logic likely applies here as it does to unfinished tasks. Emotional tension drawing from the same cognitive pool, layering on top of the residue that's already there. People who find that certain task switches feel harder than others, ones that follow a difficult conversation or a piece of feedback that stung, are often experiencing this compounding effect. And underneath all of it, there's rhythm. A day that never settles, notifications arriving into the evening, no clear boundary between working time and rest, the habit of checking one last thing before sleep, means the system never fully clears before the next day begins. The residue from one day carries silently into the next. You start each morning already behind. These connections run deeper than most people realize. If you want to explore how they show up in your own life, there's more at the link below. So the real question is, how do we actually work with the brain rather than just pushing against it? Let's work through it step by step, because the shift here is smaller than you might expect, but it has to be deliberate to work. The key insight from Sophie Leroy's research is this: the brain's reluctance to let go of an unfinished task isn't irrationality. It's the brain protecting you from losing something important. The way to help it release that task isn't to tell it to stop thinking about it. That rarely works, and research on the prefrontal cortex confirms it. The way is to give it a signal that the task has been registered, that a plan exists for returning to it, that it's safe to set it down. This is the logic behind what Leroy and her research collaborator Teresa Glom tested in their work: a brief written note taken before switching tasks, recording exactly where you are and what the next step would be when you return. In their studies, participants who created this kind of note before being interrupted showed significantly higher focus on the new task and significantly better quality of work on it compared to participants who switched without doing anything. The act of writing, not thinking, Writing was what made the difference. It creates something external the brain can rely on, rather than maintaining it as an internal background process at a cognitive cost. The practical version of this, adapted for a real working day, has two parts. The first, before every task switch, take 60 seconds to write 1 or 2 sentences, where you are in the current task, what the specific next step would be when you return. Anything that's currently unresolved. Not a full summary, not a to-do list, just a handover note, something that tells your brain the task is parked, not lost. You can do this on paper, in a notes app, at the top of the document itself. The medium doesn't matter. The externalization does. The second, applying this same logic to the structure of your working day suggests protecting the first 90 minutes of your morning as a single interrupted block. Before messages, before email, before you find out what's urgent for someone else, use it for the one task that requires the most concentrated thinking from you that day. This matters because the research is clear that the cost of fragmentation doesn't stay local. It compounds. A morning that begins with rapid switching doesn't just slow the morning down. It raises the baseline cognitive burden that everything else in the day runs against. Starting with 90 minutes of genuine focus is like giving the brain a clean surface to work from. Everything after it runs differently. Neither of these requires a personality overhaul. They require treating task transitions as something worth a minute of deliberate attention, rather than something you pass through without stopping. Daniel still has the same calendar, the same volume of reports landing in his inbox, the same cluster of messages waiting when he opens his laptop. But before he closes anything now, before he moves from one task to the next, he writes one sentence. Where he was, where to pick up. Some mornings it takes 30 seconds. Some mornings, when the work is complicated, it takes a little longer. What he notices isn't dramatic. It's quieter than that. The afternoons feel less used up. The commentary that used to take 3 fragmented hours now tends to come together in one. And the heaviness that had been building for months, the one he'd been attributing to age, to stress, to everything except the actual cause, has started, slowly, to lift. That's the mechanism working with him instead of against him. If you recognize Daniel somewhere in what we covered today, this is a good place to start. One transition note, one protected morning block, 5 working days. See what shifts. In the next episode, we turn from the mental to the physical, and to something that affects almost everyone who carries stress in their body, and almost no one correctly identifies. You wake up and your shoulders are already tense. You haven't lifted anything. You haven't slept badly. You haven't done anything yet. You're just tight. And the harder you try to relax, the more the tension seems to dig in. We'll look at what's actually driving that, and why the usual fixes rarely reach the real cause. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. You deserve it. Your Space Today is published every Tuesday at 6 p.m. For detailed information, disclaimers, scientific references, visit the links below this podcast. This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with your healthcare provider regarding any health concerns